My name's Vickie Cooper. I'm a lecturer and researcher at the Open University in the Department of Social Policy and Criminology. Myself and David White have just edited a new book called The Violence of Austerity, and it's a book with 30 chapters where we try to consolidate compelling evidence, but in disparate areas. We try to consolidate that and bring it together under one book. We see austerity as a violently political project, and we use the term institutional violence to understand the ways in which austerity, first and foremost, is affected through state-led institutions. It's enforced through state-led institutions. So what that means is that if you're a service user of, say, the NHS, of the benefit centres, of local housing authorities, criminal justice system, etc., your first primary experience of austerity effects, of austerity cuts, is through those agencies, through those institutions. And then that will have all sorts of other damaging effects on people's personal lives. So we wanted to look at this notion of institutional violence to show how the violent outcomes of austerity isn't like interpersonal violence. It's not the way in which we would think about violence, where violence is committed between two people. And it's certainly not the types of, or the typical violence that we talk about, like street violence, gang violence. It's not organised violence in that way. There's no typical perpetrator that tabloids would really focus on. So our point in the book was that the moral panic isn't about individuals committing violence. The moral panic should be about the government actually committing and targeting specific groups in ways that have extremely violent outcomes. The increase in homelessness and the cuts to tenants' rights over the last 7 years it's already had big impacts on the electoral system. It's had big impacts on voting participation. It's had big impacts on political participation, specifically amongst young people who are living in multiple occupancy accommodation, which includes mainly young unemployed people and also students. In 2000, just before the last general election in 2015, the Conservative government decided to speed up the changes to the electoral system, which meant that people living in multiple occupancy accommodation had to register to vote individually. Before 2015, it was up to the head of any multiple occupancy household to register the entire people living in that accommodation. So effectively, what we saw after the 2015 general election, we saw almost 1 million people not registered to vote, which was a massive decrease in the previous general election. So then, fast forward 2 more years, this year the Conservative government have introduced a very controversial housing benefit policy that they tried to introduce actually in 2013, but the homeless charities wouldn't let them. And they've done it now, and they've introduced a new housing benefit policy to exclude 18 to 21-year-olds from housing benefit entitlement completely. Working age 18 to 21-year-olds are now excluded from housing benefit entitlement. That's the same age group who would be living in multiple occupancy accommodation who would have been wiped off the electoral register. So effectively, the Conservative government are going after the same young people who they've wiped off the electoral register. So there's a real connection between the political participation or lack of political participation, and then also the policies implemented that directly affect people's entitlement to housing benefits. Currently, under this austerity period, not only are we seeing a rise in the number of evictions and a rise in the number of temporary accommodation and a rise in the number of homelessness, in order for local councils to cope with a dwindling housing stock and rising number of homeless people and homeless households, they're sending homeless families outside of the council areas. They're sending families not to the neighbouring council areas, but they're sending families to completely different cities. And this is especially happening in London because there's a huge lack of affordable housing within councils. We call this geographical displacement, this act of sending homeless families out of their home communities. Geographical displacement on record last year, and this is only on record, this is only what we know about, because a lot of people will leave cities voluntarily. There were 20,000 households recorded as being geographically displaced from their local authority area. In London, lots of families have been moved to Basingstoke, to Manchester, to Birmingham and to Hull as well. Now, what that means is for children especially, first and foremost for children, they have to move, they have to leave their school. For the adults, they have to leave their families, they have to leave their support networks. So it has all sorts of physical and psychological effects on their well-being when they leave their home communities. We've recently received copies of the book, and we've sat down and read it, and reading it again, it's very sad. The book's very sad. It's the sheer scale of violence that is inflicted on people as a result of the global financial crisis. People that weren't necessarily themselves to blame for the global financial crisis. The very nature and the very design of austerity policies means cuts to public expenditure. And the people who need those cuts to public expenditure were not the people that profited off the global financial crisis. And yet these are the people that we're seeing, these are the people we're talking about in the book, who are experiencing firsthand the violence caused by austerity. And it's massive. And we're talking about a huge realm of different areas, and what we're talking about in the book is only the violence that we see now. It's only the violence that we've seen in the past 7 years, not the violence that we're going to see in the next 5 years. And for me, that's the really upsetting thing as we were writing the book, as we were bringing the book together, and then reading it now on print. It's quite hard to take all of that, that scale of violence that people have experienced under austerity and will continue to experience if austerity measures are still the way forward after the next general election. The message to be taken from what we've learned in doing the books, doing the book, the Violence of Austerity, is to keep fighting and to keep foregrounding your campaigns, no matter how small. It was only through visiting those local campaign groups that I really understood the size at which these individuals were working with, the size of debt, the amount of individual personal debt that these charities are working with to write off, the nuts and bolts of an appeal for bedroom tax that can take 200 pages to file an appeal, and it's people with no wages, people who are working on behalf of those people most affected by austerity in order to get their voices heard. And it's through those small movements but massive tasks that we're seeing campaign groups build from strength to strength. And where the campaign group might not always be successful, and certainly housing campaign groups have seen this, they will then use that experience and they then use those skills to form other, stronger, bigger campaign groups to take the same issues forward. And eventually what we see are really successful results.